Hey, we're going to take a look. This is going to be completely, well, different than most of the lessons I put together. We're going to talk about the classic Elvis tune, Love Me Tender. But it's a very easy song to strum and sing, especially if you have a voice like Elvis's, unlike a voice like mine. But what I'm going to do in this lesson is talk about how you can, one, figure out the chords by yourself without, and some of the options. Two, listen to the original and pay attention to certain things, like make sure you understand the melody, figure out the bass line. And so part of what's going to come along with, and this lesson is going to have really nothing, no attachments, nothing. You're going to have to like take your own notes in here. So just fair warning, maybe not for everybody. But at the end of this, you will be able to play hopefully, your own solo arrangement of Love Me Tender. We're going to talk about chords. We're going to do this in the key of D because that was the original key that it was in. We're going to talk about the chords that were in the key, chords that are in the key. The song uses a few chords that are outside of the key, so we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about listening carefully to when the chords change, and understanding the melody, and then deciding what chord could be used for a particular measure or half measure, depending on what the melody notes are in that measure. So we're going to talk about harmonizing melody, figuring out, paying attention to the recording, which is included as part of this lesson, to hear what's going on in the bass in particular, and listening very carefully to the guitar part. And so in particular, the original recording from 1956, I believe, had 3 verses, and the third verse is the best one to listen to because it's stripped down to really just the guitar and the voice, and you don't hear other instruments and things in there, so you can hear the guitar a lot clearer in that. So first of all, listen to it a lot, figure out how to play the melody just using notes out of the key of D, and that's the first thing we'll talk about, is the D scale and chords in the key. And then also how to figure out what chords include what notes for you to try to harmonize the melody. Okay, so a lot coming up in this lesson, and I will, enough chit-chat about it. Let's get started. We're going to start this with a crash course in music theory. I'm going to try to keep this to less than 10 minutes. We'll see how it goes. The first thing, we're going to be talking about the key of D. And so the first thing you need to know is a D major scale. Now, every major scale follows a pattern of whole steps and half steps that has a whole step between all of the notes, all of the numbers, except 3 and 4, and 7 and 8. So my D major scale on the guitar, well, on any instrument, will start on D, but we're going to do it starting on the open D string. It's going to be a whole step to note 2, which would be E, a whole step to note 3, which would be F sharp, so at the 4th fret of the D string, a half step to note 4, which would be G, open, a whole step to note 5, which would be A, 2nd fret of the G string, a whole step to note 6, which would be B, on the open 2nd string, another whole step to note 7, which is going to take me to C sharp, and then a half step home to 8, D. So our D major scale has 2 sharps in it, F sharp and C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. Now, every key, aside from including the 7 notes of the scale, includes 7 triads, one built on each step of the scale. Now, triad number 1, in the case of every major key, is built on step 1, which in this case is D, and it will include notes 3 and 5 of the scale, which would be D, F sharp, A. Some of you, I'm sure a lot of you are already on top of this. So every major key has a major triad on chord 1. When I use the word triad here, I'm meaning specifically a chord that has exactly 3 notes in it, not 4 notes, which would be a 7th chord or something that had some kind of number in it, other than 1, 3, or 5. And we're going to go through the 7 triads in the key here, hopefully kind of quickly. Triad number 1 is built on D, and it includes the notes D, F sharp, and A, 1, 3, and 5. So D major is triad number 1. I might even start using the word chord, but every time I use the word chord in here for now, I'm going to mean triad, 3-note chord. Triad 2 will be built on step 2, which is E, and it'll include notes 2, 4, and 6, which would be E, G, B. And that is an E minor chord, and that's because the distance between E and G, the root and third of this chord, is less than the distance between D and F sharp, which were 1 and 3 of triad 1. So, chord 2, E minor, E, G, B. Chord 3 will be built on step 3, F sharp, and it'll be F sharp, note 3, A, note 5, and C, note 7. That's F sharp minor. So F sharp minor is chord number 3 in the key. When we get to chord 4, and the reason I'm numbering these a little bit differently than you might think. I'm numbering them according to what step of the scale each note in each triad is. So again, triad 1 is 1, 3, and 5. Triad 2 is 2, 4, and 6. 6, got to need another finger. Triad 3, F sharp, will be notes 3, 5, and 7. Now I'm up to triad 4, which will start on G, which is note 4. It'll include notes 4, 6, and 8, which is 1. That would be G, B, D. That would be G major. Okay, we continue this process and we get to chord 5, which is also going to be major. It'll include notes 5, 7, and 2, A, C sharp, E. We get to triad 6, which will be built on B, which will include notes 6, 8, or 1, and 3. That's B minor. And we get to note 7, C sharp, and we now have notes 7, 2, and 4, C sharp, E, G, which would be a C sharp diminished triad. For what we're going to do in this song, we're not going to worry about that too much. Okay, important takeaway from this is that in every major key, you have major chords on steps 1, 4, and 5, and a diminished chord on step 7, and minor chords on the other 3, which would be 2, 3, and 6. Okay, that's the early part. Now, here's the note that I want you to take, and that is we want to be able to figure out what every chord that includes a certain note in the key. So if we're trying to find a chord that includes F sharp in it, what we want to do is kind of quickly be able to not just play our chords randomly and see which ones of those include F sharp. We want to have a logical way of figuring out what chords have a specific note. In this case, the note is F sharp that I just pulled out of my hat. Okay, well, since all the triads I just mentioned, all 7 of them, consist of 3 notes, a root, a third, and a fifth. Any given note pulled out of the scale, any one of the 7 notes, will be in 3 of the triads, because it'll be the root in one, it'll be the third in another, and it'll be the fifth in another. And again, if we want to branch out into bigger chords, it could be in more, but it's only in 3 triads. So I pick a note like F sharp, and I say, okay, well, the chord that's going to have F sharp in it as the root will be, of course, be the F sharp chord in this key, which is chord number 3, which means F sharp minor. There's one of my chords that includes note 3. So if anytime I'm looking for a chord that includes F sharp, I'm going to consider F sharp minor. I also want to know what chord will have F sharp as the third. So for that, I have to think backwards. F sharp is 3. 2 would be the note before, which would be E. 1 would be the note before that, which would be D. That means my D triad in this key will, of course, include F sharp as well. And it'll be the third of the chord. Sure enough, you play a D chord, and you see I've got an F sharp up on the top string. Then now I want to figure out what chord would have it as the fifth. Well, I'm going to apply the same little function or formula and back up 2 more notes, because I would now think, okay, F sharp would be the fifth. I don't really need to do all that math again and figure out what would be 4 or what would be 3, because that's the 2 notes I just did. So what was the root of the chord that had it as the third? I just need to go back 2 more. So from D, I'm going to go back to, that would mean D would be 3 in this chord. I'm going to go back to C sharp, which would be the second of this, and B would be the root of the chord that would then include F sharp as the fifth. And sure enough, I play a B minor chord, and there's my F sharp. So if F sharp is the note I'm looking for a chord for, those are my first three choices. F sharp minor that has it as the root, D that has it as the third, and B minor that has it as the fifth. So a little note page you could make for this that would be really handy is write down the scale. D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp. We only need 7 notes. And then underneath each of those letters, put down what would be the third and the fifth of that chord. So under your list of D, E, etc., the first third under the D would be the third note of the scale, F sharp. Now you could just write out the rest of the notes from F sharp up to E in this case, and that would be your whole second line. And that would give you the thirds of all those chords. So the middle line on your note page here will go F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, E. Those are all the thirds of the 7 triads. Do the same thing in a third row, putting in the fifth of these chords. That means we're going to start with A, note 5. So under your D and your F sharp, put an A. And that's going to go same thing. A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G. Now you have vertically all of the triads in the key spelled out, root, third, fifth. And so if we now go back and look, now if we say we were looking for a chord for F sharp, and you just go through that list of 7, and you'll find out that F sharp was in 3 of those chords, and they were the 3 we just found: F sharp minor, D major, and B minor. Okay, so you can use that as your, I hate to call it a cheat sheet, but you might even, because after you've done this a couple of times, you'll be able to do this in your head and be even able to take this one step further to where if we figure out the note we're looking for a chord for is note 4 in the key, we could figure out, well, it's going to be the root of chord 4. It'll be the third of chord, I got to back up, of chord 2. And it'll be the fifth of not chord 1, but chord 7. So note 4 in our key will always be in the chords 4, 2, and 7. Okay, there's about my 10-minute talk on this, because now we'll branch out into we'll start talking about the melody, and so in the next segment, what I want you to try to do is figure out the melody to the song now, which I played at the beginning of this, back in the intro. I just played it in harmonics, and that was just to get you to have the tune in your head. But if you think about this melody, we have this. Do 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 do. Figure out how to play that, and we'll talk about it more in the next segment. Now, when I just hummed the melody back in the last segment, I did it with a very strict rhythm. I almost quantized it significantly different than Elvis sings it. And for our purposes, we don't want to worry about exactly the timing of every note that Elvis put in there, because every time he would do it, it would be a little bit different. So we want to kind of square it up into just nearby eighth notes and have a rough idea, but we want to have the notes really clear in our head. And so if what I hear in this is this. And the second line virtually the same. The third line, something like this. Fourth line, very similar to the first two. Ooh. again, that fourth line a little bit different. So I've pretty much laid out this rhythm with the same thing in most measures, because we usually have phrases of two notes. Do 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 do. So I'm feeling that as a pair of eighths on beat 1. 1 and 3 and. In the next measure, virtually the same, but we have one less note. Do do do. Third measure, same rhythm. Do 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 do. Fourth measure, just a whole note. Do. So that's the melody you want to have in your head, and you want to be able to play that down here. Now I played it up the neck there just so you could hear it, but not necessarily see what I'm playing. Okay, but figure out that melody now down in this area of the neck with our notes right out of the D scale. And if you play a D chord, you should be able to find that the first two notes are part of it. Well, I'm going to interrupt this, and now before we actually talk about what you think you heard, we're going to take another approach here, and that is figure out what chords might happen in each measure because of what the melody notes are. So if we take the first, getting back to the melody, you should have this melody down now pretty well in your head. It goes from A to D to C sharp to D. That's the first measure. So if we think about, and the next measure is E to B, and back to E. Third measure is D to C sharp, B to C sharp, and then it ends on D. So we have a little 4-measure phrase here where the last measure only has one note in it. Most of the other measures have a couple different notes. And what we want to do is try to figure out what chords would fit with the combination, the set of notes that happen in each measure. Okay, if we only had one note in the measure, like measure 4, the note is D. We kind of apply the things we talked about a little while ago, or back earlier, about what chords include the note D. Well, D is note 1 in our key. So it's going to be in chord 1 as the root, which of course would be a D chord. It would be the third of chord number 2 before 8 takes me to 6, which would be B minor. So a B minor chord would include D. And it would be the fifth of the chord 2 before B, A, G. So my three choices to harmonize the note D are either D major, B minor, or G major. This is the fourth measure of our phrase. It's the end of a line. We are coming home to D in measure 4. So we hear do 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 do. Okay, it's got to come home to D. So if we only have one note that is like the primary note in a measure, we're going to look at, it could be one of 3 chords that include that note, because it's either going to be the root, the third, or the fifth. If I happen to have 2 notes that are maybe a third apart, like if I had a B and a D in the measure, that would mean those notes would have to be either 1 and 3 of the chord or 3 and 5 of the chord.